What would you say to your 12-year-old self? This simple yet profound question has sent me on a journey back to childhood to find healing for today. I'm Mike Nicholson, a lifelong educator with over 25 years devoted to young minds. I'm here to celebrate those dedicated to the service of young people and to delve into how they navigate their personal healing amidst the childhood pain they witness in their daily lives. Together, we forge actionable steps to kickstart the healing journey for the young people of today. Join me as I speak with teachers, mental health professionals, coaches, and more, and uncover the wisdom they would share with their 12-year-old selves. Together, we strive to build a foundation for healing that many of us never had. So what would you say to your 12-year-old self? A special note before starting, this podcast is in no way intended to take the place of any kind of mental health assistance. We are simply having discussions about healing and learning and growing. If you need mental health attention, please seek a professional. Joy Marilie Jackson is a native New Yorker with a master's degree in early education and over 20 years of experience in the education field. She has worked as a teacher, curriculum developer, instructional coach, school leader, and currently as an education consultant. Beyond her work in schools, Joy began studying child development independently, which led her to become passionate about conscious discipline in schools and homes. She began sharing her experience and knowledge on child development and conscious parenting on her social media platforms, where she reaches over 150,000 followers. Joy has expanded her services to include working with families directly. She offers live and self-paced courses on conscious parenting and works with families one-on-one as a conscious parenting coach. She specializes on working with families with toddlers, first-generation gentle or conscious parenters, and cycle-breaking parents. I'm really excited to share this conversation I had with Joy Marilie. She really opened my eyes a lot about what conscious parenting is. I think it's something that we do as a family. In my family, I didn't know it had a name, but I just found her work and her content very, very interesting. And the thing that really jumped out at me, and you're going to hear us talk about it, is she has this belief and she asserts that children are no different than any other protected class in our society, no different than women, people of color, people with disabilities. And she explains that in such a way that I find so interesting. And it hit me personally in a very, very visceral way. And I don't know if that's was her intention. I don't know if I was her audience for it, but when she said that and I saw it in her content, I couldn't wait to talk to her about it because it's just an interesting prospect that children are protected classes and marginalized communities, no different than others in our society. So there's that, and there's a lot more in this conversation. So I hope you really enjoy it. Joy's great and a very compelling person to speak with, and I'm looking forward to hear this. So without any further ado, here is Joy Marilie Jackson. Joy Marilie, thank you so much for joining us here on Your 12-Year-Old Self.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I would like to, we're going to get into a lot of what you do because I'm very curious about it. As I mentioned in the open, I'm also very curious about some of the things you've said on your website and also in your content. There's one thing in particular than your content that I'm so intrigued by that I want to get into.
Okay.
So I'd like to start how I try to start every one of these is ask you, tell me about your life when you were 12.
Okay. So I think immediately of middle school, and it's funny that I say middle school because school was not at all the priority. I remember very little about the academics at that time, even though I was in a whatever name the talented and gifted program was in school, although I was in that and had access to a lot. I remember some of those things, but largely I just remember my social world being absolutely everything. Passing notes during class, looks that someone gave you, what that meant, how my clothing impacted my social standing, just a lot of stress around social things. And also, prior to cell phones, being on the phone for hours talking about just the social dynamics of school. So it's funny that school was central, but the social component of school, not so much school itself.
What about home? What was home like for you at that
So
around that age?
So home was relatively calm. I think I was the source of it not being calm because of, just entering adolescence and I knew absolutely everything. I knew absolutely everything. And was very, very close to my mom. And I lived with both parents. My dad worked evenings, so my mom was still primary caregiver. And I went to school in the neighborhood where she ran a preschool. So I was around my mom a lot. And if the word spoiled is valid, like hugs and snuggles and just being close to her was just very normal to me until around that age, about the 12-year-old, 12, 13 year olds old is when
That
things
story I
shifted.
hear so many times from parents about
Yeah,
my brother would tell me because I have a little girl. My brother would say, "Well, you're going to lose her at around 12,
yeah,
and you're going to get her back around 19." Is what it is like that.
yes. It was
Um,
shorter for me, definitely a shorter period of time for me, fortunately. But it was more, I just didn't want her to be involved. I knew everything. I wanted more privacy. I wanted more independence. And I struggled with that because my mom ran a school. I grew up in New York City. We lived in Queens. My mom ran a school in Brooklyn. And so because she knew the educators in the community, I was always able to go to school in the neighborhood where she ran a school. So I would go to her job after work. And it was just, I kind of felt like I was raised at her daycare center. But by middle school, I guess it was just too much. I was like, it's too much, mom. And I just needed more space.
and of
So it
course,
was challenging. My mom cried a lot because of my pushing her away so much at that time.
interesting. And of course, you end up in education later.
Yep, yep.
Yeah. So what's interesting, you mentioned middle school. My background is such that I was a teacher and an administrator for about 25 years.
Okay.
I taught English and TV and film production at a high school, but then I was an administrator for the last 11 years of my career before retiring early, which part of the thing that led me to my journey here. And you nailed middle school, right? Like,
Yeah.
and to give you some context about what starts this journey for me to get into how to serve or help students that age is you knew, like, think of all those stressors you had at 12 you just mentioned, right? Were my clothes good enough? Was my hair good enough? Was my shoes? You had a mom to go home to still, and
Yes.
who was
Yes.
very nurturing
Yes.
and what I'm doing now is I am reflecting on a career where I was dealing with the students who didn't have that, right?
Yes.
So what I always said was it's ridiculously hard to be that age in middle school. It's
Hmm.
ridiculously hard. Then add being gay,
Yeah.
or then add being poor, or then add not having the right clothes,
Hmm.
or in where I worked, it's a very white town. Like those kids
Mm.
struggled with um, the kids of color in my school struggled with that part of it.
Hmm.
Um, so that kind of, I always call it this. I had this very much a proximity to pain. I called it, like I would always
Yeah.
see this,
Hmm.
that, and I had empathy. But what I realized in reflecting is I it affected me, and it brought I was constantly faced with my own childhood trauma.
Yeah.
Right, that's what led me here. So
Yeah.
that's why I start with that. So you're in middle school, you break away. Did you ever do any kind of rebelling, or like besides just generally pushing your mom away?
I didn't have a huge rebellious phase. I would say that, my work is in conscious parenting, and I think my mom was probably first generation without labeling it. Um, but I would say like the biggest thing, and it was the one and only time my mom hit me because I didn't know that my parents had made an agreement not to hit me. They both were essentially abused in childhood and being beaten by anything that was nearby. And so they had both made a decision. And both of my parents were born in the 50s, so pretty progressive on their part
Mm-hmm.
to have made that choice. But the day that I got my mother hit me was a day that I was hanging out in the summer with my god sister in the neighborhood with boys. And it was just the day just kind of got away from us. We went to the movies, and then I called her afterwards, like, hey, can we now go to the mall to get some food in the food court? And then we're going to take the bus home. And then the bus didn't come. And we were just like, well, let's just walk. And it's kind of, it was summertime. So you know how in your mind it's like, it's not dark yet, but it's like almost 9 o'clock. And our brain is like, it's not dark yet. But, this is prior to cell phones, prior to me, or I may have had a beeper at the time, but it still was, my mom was absolutely panicked. And so nothing crazy had happened except just time getting, lost. And so I got to my godmother's house and my mom was fuming, and I had a smart remark. Whatever she said to me, I had a smart remark about her overreacting to me being out with boys and it's nighttime, boys that she didn't know. And it's like we had gotten to our driveway, and I used to have to get out to open up our gate to let her drive in the driveway. And the smart remark I made, she basically beat me out of the car. And I laugh about it now because it wasn't my parents' parenting approach, but it was like my mom had lost it, but I knew that the fear was the source of that. But there was nothing where I was deliberately like, I have to rebel, because I do think my mom was trying so hard not to create a big gap. She was always trying to understand why I was behaving the way I was and sought to understand that and give me a little bit of space. She was annoyed by my smart mouth, absolutely. But beyond that, it was most like that talk constantly.
It's interesting because the people that I've been speaking with for this podcast, many of them, I think all of them so far, weren't led to a career in serving young people let me go back. That the people I've spoken with, including myself, what we've realized is we were driven to serving young people as teachers, or I'm an academic coach or a learning success coach now, was our own childhood trauma from not getting something that we know now we probably were missing. And I just find it interesting that that's not your story. No. Your story was one of nurturing and friendship, good friends, positivity. So how does that journey happen? What is it? What takes you from that child? Was it this thing that you wanted to be like your mom? You just wanted to get in the family business?
Well, and I'll say, let me rewind a little bit, and because processing this time, it took me a while to process this period of time and like reflecting prior to this. And I would say the only thing that stuck to me, and I'm not like comparing it to any like trauma at this point, was always struggling with my weight and being teased about my weight in childhood. I would say, around this time, and it's a time where I intentionally lost weight, and I'm thinking about the period I went where I didn't eat, like I would just have Tic Tacs all day. Mm-hmm. And so that's a piece of me that I think still lives with me. And even when I've gone to points where where I lost weight and felt confident in my size and being in shape and things like that, I have never let go of who I was at that period of time. I remember little things like being in gym, and the default position we were supposed to sit in gym was on the floor with our knees up and hug your legs. Yeah. And having a big belly, that was the most uncomfortable thing on the planet. And I used to think that everyone could notice because there were kids who could have their knees up and touch their two elbows. I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So I just remember there was a lot of self-consciousness around that. And what I hated the most, the biggest fashion then, was around Levi's jeans. And it had your size on it.
Oh, I hated that. I ripped those off.
I was just like, this is just way too cruel. Because my midsection was inches bigger than other people. I just, I hated that. So those things stay with me, and I know have impacted me in a way that I don't know that it's just about middle school as much as it is as weight is perceived in society overall. It's just certainly just wasn't as big an issue in elementary school. It's like now the way you look and thinking about boys. I remember they used to separate the boys and girls in the lunchroom. And so we used to pass, but there was garbages lined down the cafeteria. So that's where notes were passed. A girl and a boy would both go to the garbage. You pass a note, and that's how we communicated. But I remember there was a new boy in school, and he liked Well, me and one other girl liked him. And so, of course, now he had to choose because that's just how middle school is. We found out they both like you, and now you
Yeah.
have to choose between them. And it would be like, well, this girl, well, Joy is prettier, but the other girl's skinny,
Oh,
and so those things have always stayed in my mind that I know that still impact me to some extent because it's such a stage where your image of yourself and through the lens of other people, at least for me, is when it became prominent. I feel like I was in an absolute bubble
yeah.
prior to that time.
I completely relate to all of that.
Mm.
But that goes back to what I said earlier. That's such a hard age just to be alive.
Yeah.
Then add that. That's a stressor. And that
Yeah.
is, a boy saying to you, I'm choosing this girl because she looks better than you.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to make everything trauma. That's not my thing.
Yeah.
But those are things that stick with you.
Yes.
And that little, like, every issue every fat joke ever said towards me as a little boy, like, there's still that boy I'm trying to protect at this age.
Yep.
And I'm sure you
Yep.
go through the same thing.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I would say, leading back to your initial question around my journey, it's kind of like I've had a social media journey that has now aligned where education and social media are intertwined, but it hasn't always been that way. So I've had the social media thing, and then I've had my profession. I just feel like teaching, I don't want to say, I wasn't intentionally trying to follow the family business, which is interesting because my grandmother was a teacher, my mom was a teacher, then leader. I have 3 godmothers, they're all in education. One of them is married to a principal. I think it was just being surrounded by educational conversations that piqued my interest in children, or that just kind of led to it. And then I had an opportunity. I was a music education major in school, and so I went to a performing arts. The arts have always been a big part of my world. And so, the chubby band kid also had all of those things going for me.
Oh,
but
now we're getting to the heart of it.
But I had an opportunity. I was very successful in the arts, and so when I went to a performing arts high school, during the summer, the middle school teacher used to always let older kids come back and teach the kids over the summer. So I volunteered to do that, and the very first time I did that, I fell in love with teaching, and I was 16. And I was just like, I remember telling my mom, I'm like, I absolutely love teaching, and they were only kids, a few years younger than me.
What was it? What was it? I'm so sorry to cut you off, but
yeah,
you pinpointed the moment where you fell in love with teaching. Do you know what it was about it?
I guess it was just seeing like a before and after impact. I'm trying to describe it because I still kind of get that high, but just having the experience of someone not being able to do something and see them light up when they can. The experience of progress. Like I was leading a band and teaching kids who played clarinet. And I also realized in retrospect that my band teacher was lazy as all F because he would just leave all those kids with me at 16.
Oh my gosh.
But I guess I enjoy, there's a piece of me too that loves challenges. And is competitive, and I don't know what hit me at 16, but I kind of knew that I wanted to keep that in my life.
Interesting.
But I think it was just I guess it was the impact, and it was the combination of 2 things that I guess I liked was the act of teaching, and seeing progress, because this has permeated every aspect of my life, education, or being an educator, and then there's just loving music and being able to offer that to someone else, especially music literacy. I love, and exposing people to this language. It is a language that I always make this analogy of, like, if I'm not fluent in Spanish, and if I hear a Spanish speaker, or let me say something even more, just let's say Russian. I don't know a single word in Russian, and if I hear someone speaking that language or what sounds like a Slavic language to me, I can fully ignore it. I can tune it out because it's like, I might notice tone, something like that, but that's it. But when you hear someone speaking your language, you start eavesdropping. You can't help it. You start listening in. And music is that same thing. For people who aren't musically literate, who don't really understand, they can hear music and it's a passive experience. And once you become musically literate, you can't listen to it the same way. Your ear gets pulled into that. And so I loved giving that. And as I've grown older, I've realized that that's part of the experience. But I think that's where it began, is that I'm helping people enter a world that is a world that a lot of people just don't have access to.
Yeah, I love that. And I love, as a guy who loves music, who's generally speaking, music, and more so words, lyrics
Yes.
are a huge part of my life.
Yep.
I can barely carry a tune. I don't play an instrument. And I am envious of people who speak your language. I'm envious when I'm around musicians and they hear music. Something comes on and they go, "Oh yeah, see that? Yeah, that's it." Like because I've been around musicians a lot, and I can only compare it to, like, I've made movies and stuff. So if I'm watching a movie or something, and people I've worked with, I see something, and we might have the same conversation. But the music part, I'm envious that I don't have, that I'm not literate like that.
Yeah.
So you taught music at 16, but if I read your bio correctly, you were a pre-K teacher.
So I taught music from early child, like mommy and me classes, through second grade, the majority of my career. And I was a teacher for about 14 years.
Okay. So that wasn't public school then?
Yes, it was.
Oh,
so it's a combination. So in public schools, which was the majority of my career, 10 years plus, was in public and public charter schools in New York City and generally urban communities. And then mommy and me classes, like when I was in college, I did everything. I was teaching the entire time I was in undergrad, I always had like a side gig. So even if I was teaching full time on the weekends, I might have been doing private lessons or also doing mommy and me classes. So it always was a
interesting
range. Mm-hmm.
So this gets into a little bit of what I jump into this world of podcasting and media and everything else because I'm driven by this thought of those of us who work with young people and what it means to work with the child who comes to you who is coming from a traumatic home or something like that.
Yeah.
And again, I go back to that term proximity to pain is all I keep saying. Like, you have that, you see that. And my thing is, when I started this, is I want to talk to people and see how it affected them, how it kind of like how they took care of them, how they take care of themselves with it as well. But how did it affect your trajectory? Because I believe it sounds to me where we're going in your trajectory, it sounds like you become more of a champion for taking care of that kid as you get older or as you move on in your journey. So Is that something you experienced in that? Was it the Bronx you worked in?
That was one of the places I worked in. So I would say my interest, I think so I had a very stable nuclear family, but not necessarily a stable family beyond that. So it's not like seeing the trauma or the challenges, especially within Black communities, was so distant to me. I had a front row seat to a lot of it between my peers and my extended family. I am like only one of my other cousins lived in a family with both parents. My other cousins were their mom was 13 and 14 when she had them. Most in single parent households. My grandparents raised a lot of my other cousins. So there was kind of a lot of firsthand experience with seeing the issues within, in working class and poor communities. And feeling like my mom made the difference in separating me because my mom was educated, had a master's degree, and kind of was like, we visit the family for barbecues and major holidays, and other than that, we're over here. And so to her credit, I think that was important for not normalizing a lot that was very normal in my extended family. So I think I had an interest in, I already had an interest in, I don't know, in supporting that community because it wasn't like, I don't know what's happening in the rest of the world. Right. I also, my mom's school was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which looks very different now than it did in the 80s. And so the community that I was in was largely Hispanic, another population like immigrant sub group within that was weren't native born to this country. There was another Chinese population and then maybe 20% Black. And there were just a lot of issues. I was surrounded, like I certainly felt privileged even though my parents lived paycheck to paycheck. But we lived in a house, a very small house, but we lived in a house. Most of my friends lived in the projects. I was just immersed in seeing what else was happening. I also had first hand seat to see how other people were parenting their children, and just thought I was lucky that my parents were soft, kind of thing, because I didn't know that they had intentionally decided not to beat me. So it wasn't like, I think there's some people who like would come from a place of privilege to some extent, are privileged and also in a white tower. And that wasn't my experience, right? Like I was in a position of privilege compared to my peers, but I was living in the middle, not living, but you know what I mean?
Right.
I was still there, and just happened to have parents that kind of, when we went home at 3 o'clock, I kind of went to a slightly different world.
You had the proximity that we talked about. It just wasn't necessarily in your house.
Yes.
So that's interesting too, because I want to get into what you do now.
Mm-hmm.
As you do conscious parenting, right? And
Yeah.
you think you look back now and you go, well, my mom was a first generation conscious parent, but you said at the time you thought they were just soft.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's like a perspective. Most people would imagine that at the point that I had my daughter, that I already knew the kind of parent that I was going to be. And I had just kind of taken the talking points that you often hear people say. It's just like, well, some kids need to be beat. Some kids need to time out, and like different punishments work on different children. And I think I had that same approach. Like I was just like, well, my parents were kind of soft, and I also just wasn't that bad a kid. That's why I never got beat, right? I didn't know until I started talking to my mom about this in adulthood that my parents had consciously made this decision because of their own trauma, that they would never do that to me. And then, yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
And my parents had different parenting styles. My mom was definitely, she was an educator. So she was just definitely coming from more of a place of trying to understand me, especially because I drove her nuts. At this age, she went to my middle school. That was another thing. My mom became PTA president when I was in middle school. And was just always in the building, all the things, wanted to chaperone dances. And it was just like, I just couldn't take it. And she was so hurt by it because we were so close prior to that. And my dad was working nights, and I would hurt my mom's feelings. And then she put him on the phone and he would yell at me, because that was the style, because they were just on the same page around not hitting me.
Right.
But the rest was kind of like, he was more authoritarian and she was more like, I'm just trying to understand.
He was being dragged along in that little journey. It sounds like maybe.
Yeah. Well, with the hitting, it definitely, it was on him, because he got it worse than her in terms of beating. Like he still can talk about his father beating him like so brutally that he ran away. And that stuck with him. And he absolutely was like, he knew it didn't make sense. He knew he didn't deserve that, and it didn't make sense. And so he was definitely on board with the not hitting, but he wasn't also going to get to the point. Like, he's like, I'm not beating you, but I'm going to yell at you to get what I want. Like it wasn't as processed as my mom. My mom like kind of just lost her cool around. She was the one that had to deal with my attitude so much at 12.
I'm just so intrigued because of my own for lack of a better term, narrow-mindedness. Mm-hmm. I consider myself a cycle breaker, right? Okay. Because I came from a house that there was a lot of trauma, like neglect and violence and things like that. And it took me a long time, and I'm still working on it. Mm-hmm. I became dad. I became a first-time father very late in life, because I never thought I could do it, right? Yeah. And then I met the right person, and who, by the way, sounds out like your mom, my wife. And I'm sorry, I'm just getting a little bit vulnerable here, but yeah, I guess my narrow-mindedness comes from, I thought I'd go into this podcast journey and meet people who were just like me, who were breaking cycles because they were in the cycle. Yes. But you already had yours broken, so to speak.
Yes.
But you picked up the mantle, and I'm curious about that. So, and thanks for letting me get vulnerable there. But
yeah, it's okay.
So you teach, and then based on all this, your story goes that you, from what I read on your website, you struggled as a parent early on.
Yes.
And then you just you made a conscious effort to change things up. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. And I want to come back, but I also want to say something that's coming to me, because, like I said, I don't know why I don't have like a lot of this period of time, I don't know why it didn't stand out to me in a lot of ways. And again, because it's not trauma, but you think about, there are things that remain, right? And so one thing I do think in terms of cycle breaking that I had to think about was in terms of watching my parents' relationship, which I could not stand. My parents argued constantly, and I do think if there is a piece of trauma that stays with me, it is arguing. It is people yelling. It is hearing things shuffle. Like my husband to this day, if he comes in and I hear like dishes drop hard, my heart sinks immediately because it's still like I still have the trauma of waking up constantly to hearing them yelling, right? And so when I think about that's something that lingered with me where there's like stability, where I had two working parents who both financially supported me. But when you said that you didn't know that you could be a parent, that part is not what I struggled with as much as thinking I could be in marriage because relationships just seemed like trash to me.
Interesting.
And so my mom even said to me, she's like, I thought that I ruined for you. I thought you'd never want to get married because of what you saw. And so that's interesting that it took me this long to think about that because I was all centering around me. But there was a lot that I had to heal with my father growing up because of what I'm certain was infidelity at points, which was verbal and emotional abuse with my mom. Right? He yelled at me, but it wasn't like, and I would be annoyed by that, but I had so much anger and resentment toward him, toward how he treated my mother. And so something that I realized that I had to unpack, because I heard him, he would like tease her. That was his way of like joking, would always be to tease her or put her down, especially in front of people. And so I had one long-term relationship through college. And then the man I'm married to now, we dated on and off for almost 10 years, but he was like my second, love relationship way back when. And both that, my first major boyfriend and my now husband shared with me early in the relationship, they didn't like going to places with me in public because I would tease them. And I was just like, what? Like, I tried to deny it with the first boyfriend. When I heard a separate boyfriend, now I'm in my mid-20s, say it to me, that I had a big breaking point to be like, I was repeating a pattern that I observed my dad do. And I'm happy that I was able to unpack that stuff without therapy on my own, that someone pointed it out to me. And I sobbed once I like processed it because I'm like, the thing that I resented him most for, I'm now doing. And so it's interesting that you say those things that I'm like, I'm unpacking it as I'm talking about what are the things that lingered and absolutely impacted me and in adulthood. And the cycle that I had to break was not around my parenting, but was around my partnership.
Which would have affected your parenting had it not been addressed.
Yes.
So speaking of that, then you must see a lot of that kind of behavior in working with families. A lot
yes.
So tell me about your work with families and what that looks like. I guess you say you do conscious parent. It sounds like it's like you family coaching or something is the best way for me to put it tersely. So,
and I'll rewind a little bit because the journey is not so direct that I went from this straight into working with families. I was a teacher for many years and I moved into administration, and then same thing. I had a child a little later in life. So I was already, kind of at the top of my career in administration. I was the arts director. I had managed a nonprofit before that, and had a child then, and then realized I had no time to see because I had a major shift in parenting because I was ladder climbing. I always thought that I would be that type to like have my kid and have the nanny be responsible most of the time. And I try to be transparent about that because having children wasn't a top priority for me, but I decided consciously and willingly that if I marry someone who kids are important for, then I can make that shift. But I still thought I'm going to be at work and somebody else is I'll get home at 6:00 and that'll be that. But within about a year of having my daughter, a lot changed. And so when I talk about like two shifts that happened is that I spent a good portion of my career in charter schools that were no excuses charter schools. I don't know if you are familiar with that term, but no excuses. I could guess, but... Okay. Well, so the charter school movement in New York City is huge and large and very highly competitive with the public schools. They're like enemies because funds get diverted to charter schools, but the schools were crap. So choice was created. But in a lot of these schools, they're intentionally put in Black and brown communities, under-resourced, underfunded, a lot of challenging everything. The community is facing a lot. And they put themselves in these communities to impact change. They have missions of, a lot of money gets funneled into them because they have access to a lot of money. And one of the models that has been highly criticized is the no excuses model. And being part of these systems, and they really are systems, basically you are controlling every aspect of children's bodies from their head to their toe. And the idea around this is having that level of control is only going to have positive impacts on their academic success. And the model shows success, especially in the earlier years, kind of dwindles some of that success levels off as kids are just not willing to deal with that level of control, And I would say that's right, 4th or 5th grade, already the scores don't look as great as they do in other places. And then also like just very rigid in terms of everything. There's a system and these schools replicate. So the systems are so tightly structured because you want a cookie cutter operation that you can just keep expanding and putting in more and more places. So I got a lot of my education training in these spaces. And I was trained and I was supporting people in terms of discipline. I got a lot of disciplinary training in those spaces. So even though I was like gentle parented in some way, again, without the labels, like I wasn't beaten, humiliated as part of normal discipline, I think I had learned to develop a pretty harsh disciplinary approach in the schooling system. And I questioned it. Unfortunately, this wasn't a long period of my career. I had done a lot on my own before entering the no excuses spaces. But I still, when I entered parenting, was just like, I train teachers to manage classrooms. I know how to manage a classroom. And even if I wasn't like abusive in doing it, it was just like my calm, assertive presence. I don't play. These are the expectations. I lay them out. And I think I blended that world with what I had learned prior to entering that. But I did not expect to have any issues behaviorally with my child. Not me. Not this teacher. I'm the classroom that they send the other kids that they're having trouble with. Right? Combination, not because I was always tough, but also my class was engaging. I used to see myself as managing through engagement, but I also didn't play. And so I remember hitting the point where things shifted as my daughter was 14 months old and it was in the phase of throwing food. This is also after I had decided to quit my job and I was going to return to teaching. Consulting opportunities presented themselves. So I'm largely at home now. And my 14-month-old is throwing food and I was just like, stop throwing food. And I thought that was because my calm, assertive tone was more effective in an elementary school environment. Right. And that I didn't yell, but I knew how to be a little scary, and she like essentially laughed and threw food at me again. And that's when I realized there was a huge gap in my knowledge gap after like all these years. I think at that point I had been in education 14, 15 years. And I'm like, I don't know anything. Like, what are these degrees for if I thought that was going to work? And so, yes, it was a huge shift. And I think, so many people, I had like, a strong foundation that was able for me to shift, not for me to get more, like increase and get more authoritarian. I knew that I had a knowledge gap because I'm like, this is what works in a classroom setting, but realizing there's a culture of compliance also in schools that supports that. And I decided I had to do.
You and I have a lot, like your journey and your professional journey and your approach professionally is mirrored to mine. Like I was the disciplinarian in a school. I thought I knew it all. I thought I knew how. Like I just wasn't a mom. I found someone I could trust to lead me in that way. But anyway, I'm just so taken by this similar approach we have when it comes to that. But go ahead.
Yeah. So I was far more concerned about birth than I was about raising a child because I'm a teacher. I train other teachers. This is what I do. And my daughter made me aware very early on that I didn't know anything. Not as much in that there was a huge gap in the education, at least my education went, because you're kind of trained to control students and move through kids to be the same place at the same time and individuality. Like the term differentiation is utilized, but we're going to differentiate to get you to the same place at the same time,
Yes.
right? If that makes sense.
And there's no differentiation in discipline either.
Right.
Everything's
Right.
a nail. You have a
Yes.
hammer and everything's a nail. Yeah.
Yes. And so I knew that my daughter wasn't bad. Like I was like, how could she be bad? She's 14 months, but there's something I don't understand, and I don't understand how to respond to an early toddler. And so I started doing my own research in child development. And that's when I also read a book called Spare the Kids, which is a play off the phrase spare the rod.
Mm-hmm.
And it's focusing on Black families, like why whooping Black children has not saved Black families, something like that is the subtitle. And learned the research about the negative impact on physical punishment on children. And I was like, and not that I had planned, I didn't know, I always thought I have to just wait and see. Is my kid the lecture type or the beat type? I wasn't really clear on it. And that just changed everything for me. Just understanding toddler development and all these things that I was like, how could I have been teaching in early childhood and this not have been a part of my degree? How could child development be so missing? And then I also realized that like my training programs are training me to go into public school. And also my master's degree was a program specifically targeted for charter school teachers. And I think they know that if they include more child development, that we would understand that something is wrong systemic. Like if we were more informed, we would rebel a little bit more. And as long as you can be convinced by just, the philosophy of the school, then you're like, okay, yes, that's what the school says to do. We'll go along with that. Y'all
They
use
needed
the
you to
system.
conform the way you needed the kids to conform in order for it all to work, for that system to work. Yeah.
Yes. So I just started rethinking the whole thing. So one, I saw my space, and to rewind in terms of, where I was, the chubby kid to media, is that I had a social media platform for many years, and I was, prior to the conscious parenting thing, I was a lock blogger. So this is my second set of locks, and I used to teach people how to style their hair. And I was always like, okay, I had this knack, and I also always, I had done plus size modeling. I feel like so old when I talk about all these things, that I had found a way to be confident in my own skin. And I wanted to have like an image out there to be like, you don't have to be a size 2 to feel pretty. And you also don't have to wear wigs and weaves either. Like you can have your hair look beautiful with your own natural texture, and here's how to do it. So that's kind of, I think, when you talk about the small level of trauma I experienced with teasing, my professional world didn't address that. But the fact that I was able to find success on social media, that's where that part of me went. And then parenting merged, and I gained a lot of weight. I had no idea what to do with myself anymore. And I didn't feel pretty anymore. And I didn't know what to do with my platform. I was like, I don't know what to do. But as I got this information, that I was like, I have an almost all Black female audience that is watching me style my hair, a demographic that is self-identified as like one of the most religious categories or groups of individuals in the country, which all goes along with that spare the rod, spoil the child mentality, and deeply rooted within, in media, in stereotypical and grounded in factual ways, is the Black mom that doesn't play and I'm going to whoop you behind and all that stuff. And I'm just like, but they don't know the research. And now here I have a platform that is largely catering to Black women. And now I have this knowledge base that I didn't have before. And I'm an educator. I know how to communicate things to people in a way that they can hear it. And so I'm just like, I had to take a risk. And I'm like, if I tell my Black female audience to stop beating their kids, I might lose half of them. I really did have to consider that. And I felt like I was dancing around it and sharing what I was learning about toddlers and all these little by little, but wasn't taking the leap to say, stop this, let's stop this. And then finally I was just like, you know what? Who cares? If I lose everybody, let's just start from scratch. This is information that needs to come from someone who looks like me. The gentle parenting community is dominated by white women, generally speaking. And so this is why so many Black people see this as a white parenting style. Conscious parenting, gentle parenting. That's for them. And I was just like, I have a real opportunity to reach a demographic that's not necessarily seeing themselves reflected in the people giving this information. And so that's when I made a shift. I kind of was traveling along two paths and merged them.
That's amazing. I love that story. I'm going back to, it's like I'm thinking about when you struggled to parent, and it's like you did everything. Again, I'm comparing it to myself, and
Hmm.
my wife and I follow her lead. Everything is done with intention, right? It's
Yes.
all about intentionality, and that was from the jump.
Hmm.
And that's what was missing for you when you first started as a mom.
Yes.
You
Yes.
said, "I'm going to take care of myself. I'm successful. I'm confident. I'm going to be able to handle this, and I'm going to be able to at least model what this kid should be." And without that intentionality in parenting, you didn't have it. You found it, thank goodness, and thank God
Yep.
you're smart enough to know you weren't smart. That you needed to learn more. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
And that's
Absolutely.
great. That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
Really amazing. Um, One of the things I wanted to ask you, because and this was the reason I reached out, because again, at the basis of this journey and this podcast I'm on is I want to talk to people who work with young people, and I want to talk about how we can help young people heal earlier. Like I
Mhm.
healed later in life. Well, I'm still healing. We're all still healing. My journey started, my process of healing started later in life. You wrote something and I couldn't find it. I was just looking for it and I could not find it. I don't know if
Mhm.
you wrote it or you said it or whatever. And that's when I reached out to you. You referred to children as an oppressed group.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think I put in my letter to you, in my email to you, I was shook by it
Mhm.
because, man, I believe that.
Yes.
If I think I know what you mean,
Yeah.
because I think about the lack of, when I see children and when I talk about that proximity to pain, what I see is a lack of freedom and a
Yeah.
lack of ability to take care of them. And what really at the heart of that is the person responsible for them is not giving them that.
Yeah.
Right. I was just it's so funny because I have these friends and I'm talking about, I just invited this woman on my podcast and this is what she said. And they're like, oh, that's they're like, well, I don't agree with that. I'm like, no, that's real. So can
Yeah.
you please talk? I'm sorry. Can you please talk
Yeah.
about it?
Absolutely. So I think it's not a position that I've always had, but because as you heard, there's a lot of intersection in my work, and that it's very hard for me to disconnect um, anything I learned from both looking at parenting and school systems. I also, am very strong in my cultural identity and knowing who my demographic is, and I also, and I love history. So I read a lot of historical things as much as possible, and then I always see connections. And so in that post that you referenced, I was reading the 1619 Project,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they were talking about the history, a lot, just the history of ownership of enslaved people, and talking about, I can't remember all of the details, but basically it was very important for them to keep referring to enslaved people as property and these property rights, all these things about property rights. Because as long as you were putting this in the context of property, people, there was no humanity tied to it, right? And so, you were allowed to discipline your human property in any way that you saw that, even if that led to death, because it's your property. Why would someone tell you how you can treat and not treat something that belongs to you, something that you own? Um, and I'm trying to think of the other, and there were just all these different laws that were put in place to protect the property. And then if you also look at the history of women in this country, which I had studied a little bit more because it wasn't part of my normal schooling, but I used to lead community meeting at my school, and I used to always try to find ways to make history interesting during our community meetings and during Women's History Month. I remember distributing all these different laws that were in place for women, for children to figure out which one was real or which wasn't. I can't remember what the activity was, but they were all rules that they were like, what in the world? Like, women couldn't wear pants. They were also allowed to be beaten by their husbands. And so, like, just within our lifetimes, essentially, did this become illegal. I posted another post related to this, of an article that was in the 50s, and the question was, should men spank their wives? And these men were talking about how it's effective. How else are they going to learn their lesson? If like how, guys these days don't know how to put their foot down and have control over their households. Right. And so yeah, once you do it, if you hit them a couple of good times, they'll know who's boss and you won't have this problem moving forward. Right. And so now you see this language repeat from hearing, a former enslaver, a slave master, saying the same exact things about enslaved people. Then you hear men just in the last century saying the same exact things about women. And both of those things are things that people say today about children. And we don't argue at all that these were both marginalized, oppressed groups at periods of times in this country, right? Because there were laws on the books about it. And then laws had to be put in place to protect these groups. It had to be done because people weren't doing it independently. And so I think it's so interesting that we talk about children in the same way. You have to be. You just have to. You have to. And no one flinches, or most people don't flinch when people say things like this because we don't see children as a group that is deserving of any rights. We dehumanize them in the same way we think about them as property. No one's going to tell me how to discipline my child. No one's going to tell me how to discipline my property. No one's going to tell me how to discipline my wife. Just go back a few decades. And it's the same exact language. And if those were marginalized groups who had to fight to be recognized for their full humanity legally and in common world perception, if that was true for them and the same exact phrases are carrying over, how can we see it any differently for children? It's because we put them in a category of property, which is dehumanizing, which is what we do to oppressed marginalized groups. There's groups beyond this that have experienced the same kind of language used around them, but when you see that pattern is when you can't, of course they're a marginalized, oppressed group.
And what's interesting is when I think about it, when those groups started getting rights and getting those protections, there was pushback.
Oh,
right. There's always a pushback, right?
Yes.
Whether it was to civil rights, whether it was whatever, go on and on. Same with women's rights. There's a pushback. But if you think about the last 20 or so years, children, that conversation is being had more about giving them rights.
Yep.
And now what are we hearing from pretty much the same group of people, at least what they look like, where they live, and everything else, that were doing this to people of color and to women. They're fighting. You can't mess with my stuff.
Yeah.
Right. What about a parent? I want a parent's bill of rights in my school. I want to make sure I have control.
Yes.
And it's all part of the same. From where I'm sitting, it's all part of the same pushback, the same group of people holding on to some power.
Yes. I mean, I always refer to it in the terms of like a colonized mindset, right? That colonialism is about power and dominance. Like you can, looks different ways in different places, but that's ultimately what it boils down to is stripping one group of rights and making them adapt to the wants, beliefs, and desires of another group. And I agree with you that there is a demographic resisting this advocacy for children, but the colonial mindset of this power and dominance and control, and stripping power away from another group has permeated all walks of life, right? And including the demographic that I largely serve and target. As I said to you, I was fearful of saying to Black women, you shouldn't beat your kids, and it's because this idea of power that largely I work with folks to make these connections, because when you realize that this is not, men who were publicly willing to talk about beating their wives because it was acceptable and everyone said that it was normal and everyone said you had the right to do this. This is your man, God-given right as a man to have this kind of power over your wife. And this is, this is back to biblical times, that this has been the idea of power and control and patriarchy, misogyny, all of those things. And people don't see that this is no different with children, that this is about power and dominance and dehumanization. And so this is going across racial and socioeconomic, um, you know, groups, because of the fact that once a group is dehumanized and you can separate yourself, once they are other, you don't see them as having the need for rights, right? Anytime you can other a person, and the unfortunate thing is that all adults can other children.
Yeah.
All adults can
Yep.
other children. And so, yes, I think it depends on like where you are, where you see like where the biggest push is coming from. But for me, it feels like the biggest hurdle for me um, is within the Black community for in my work, in saying that. So the idea, like, because of what you hear, is that parenting in this way, and this is what's really interesting, is that this nonviolent parenting has been, at least in communities of color, labeled as a white way to parent. And the thing that has been shocking for so many of my followers when I say this is that white people beat their kids. And don't believe it. They don't believe it. It's been, and when I'm talking about like colonial thinking, is that for centuries, Black people have been pegged, and folks of color, as being violent, as being savage, as being everyone else is calm, and folks of color are just kind of ruining their peace with their violent ways. And so, of course, it follows suit to believe that that white people are now in turn nonviolent and peaceful, despite what history has shown us globally that that's not factual, right? But we, the propaganda is such that people really believe that it's only folks of color that are beating their kids, but we have to parent our kids in that way. We can't parent like them because of all these other issues of like basically we have to harden our kids for the life that they're going to experience. Not realizing that the very people that you think are not beating their kids absolutely are. They absolutely are. It's because it's a tool of oppression, right? This is the history of this country, is you had to beat slaves into submission, you had to beat women into submission, and that we have learned to now beat our children into submission as well. And so it's frustrating that again, this is a challenge in communities of color to see there is another way, and it's not a white people way, because as you're sitting telling me there was violence and oppression in your household. But if I can send you the comment section of the video when I said, please understand that it's not just poor white people that are doing this. I am coaching affluent white people who are paying a couple of $100s a session, who are trying to figure out how to discipline their kids without hitting. Right? This permeates, and it's just, there's just a myth around who's doing it and who's not.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting. I could talk to you all night about this. And I appreciate your time. I want us to start wrapping up though, because I want to honor our time, and I have to get to our final question that I told you about, but there's also a question after it that I'm sure you'll be ready for. So about 6 months ago, I was in a certain kind of way, a crossroads in my life, job-wise, and just a lot of things going on. And I was reflecting on my own life and reflecting on my own child and reflecting on all the children I dealt with. And I received, somebody sent me a reel, and the reel read something to the effect of, my therapist gave me this exercise. Imagine standing outside the door of your own 12-year-old self bedroom. How would that feel? And then what would you go in and say, right? And I tell the story in every episode only because that moment in time completely floored me, because I struggle, and I'm still on. I think what I'm doing here is almost looking for the answer for myself, because I think about that, and I was brought to tears by this thought and by the visuals, everything. And so that's how this started. And I thought, man, if I could ask people who work with young people, what would they say to their 12-year-old self in order to help them begin their healing journey way before I did at that later age? So what would you say to your 12-year-old self, you think?
Oh my goodness. I had an answer for you that over the course of this conversation, I'm second guessing because so many other things came up. But let me start with what I shared with you is first just saying that the people that you are changing every aspect of yourself for right now are going to have very little impact on your life long term. I feel like I there was so much adjusting of myself and trying to conform to what the standard was at that time, um, which was the opposite of me in a lot of ways, being cool and fashionable and trendy and thin. That all of those things were, I was guiding myself by people who I have zero communication with today. And so I'm only grateful, as I said to you, that I didn't have anything so regrettable in that time that I had done for the purpose of someone else, to find out that, let's say it was seventh grade was the peak challenge. That by ninth grade, I was in a completely different environment with completely different people, and really just a handful of people who kept in touch with my mom remained in my life after that. And so it's more, I wish that I could have seen the big picture, but also fortunate that nothing regrettable happened in that time. But for someone else, it could have been. I could have done something a lot more drastic. But I do think that that was the benefit of, even though I was resisting my mom, of having a soft place to land when things were hard, and despite the lack of confidence I might have had outwardly, there was some confidence in what I had here in my brain. I think that helped from being at home and having a supportive parent at home.
So I have to ask you. That was your answer. You were ready to say, correct?
Yeah.
Have you been able to articulate in your brain what your new answer was, or what an altered answer was?
Yeah. Um, it would more be around, I guess, trying to heal my perspective of relationships before adulthood. And so, if I wish I could have said to myself sooner that this is not your marriage. What I was observing was not my marriage. And I invested so much anger and resentment as if I was the wife in that. And I've realized in adulthood, and especially after dissecting some of this stuff with my mother, my dad is not ready for any of these kind of conversations, but that I was just very invested in their relationship, and almost was like the watchdog for my parents' relationship, and wanting to defend, and realizing now as a wife and mother myself that oftentimes, like, adults are making decisions. And I couldn't change that. I couldn't change the grown up decisions that they made. And none of what I watched my mom experience was my fault. It wasn't my fault. There were some, and I couldn't have changed it. And I think that there was so much of me that fought and argued. And I would say the arguments that I got with my parents, with my dad specifically, was in defense of my mother. And then when I talked to my mom about all the things that I was resentful about, she's like, I kind of knew that. I was like fighting for your relationship with things that you had just been like, I remember one time she said to me, I've just gotten content, and, I'm comfortable in my house. And, I was like, oh, so I spent like a decade of my life enraged with something that you had just accepted, and so I wish I had known that a lot sooner. And I also say that one of my mom's, immersed in education, a social worker friend actually said that to me at some point. That she's like, this is not your marriage. You have to stay out of it. And so I do think that that's hard if you're seeing more, like, if there is more physical abuse happening, to just kind of step back for absolutely. But that is what I went through a lot of times, with just accepting that adults make adult decisions. And as helpless as I felt, I could have probably put that energy someplace else.
Well, here's the last thing I want to end with.
Yeah.
And I'm curious because you do this. I've asked every guest because I want to offer value. I don't want to just say, hey, what would you say? Yeah. I want to know, is there some actionable, feasible thing that you could offer to anybody that works with young people, be they a parent, a coach, a teacher, is there something you could say based on all you've learned and your own experiences that you could tell them to help that young person they work with start healing now? What can they
Mhm.
do? What can we tell them?
So it's hard for me to say this because I just feel like the nature of my work so often is not addressing the behavior of the kid as much as it is addressing the behavior of the adults. And so when I want to talk about, and as interesting as that is, I feel like part of the healing for young people is about adults healing
Well,
in
that's what I was
order
just
to
going to
be
say. You
better.
do,
Yes.
yes, you do that. Like that child, that adult is yes. I'm sorry. That's one of the things that's been hitting me is
Yeah.
yes, that that adult is often acting, protecting their own 12-year-old self
Yeah.
when they're acting a certain way with their child. I'm sure, but
Yes.
you know more than I do.
Yes.
So
Yeah. No, no. I mean, it's hard because I guess I want to shift the focus because so much of the time when we're worried about the behaviors of children, it is because we're placing a character flaw on the child. And so I also feel like to focus on the child learning how to heal themselves is also not acknowledging how much the adults have to do with the child's ability to do that. And so that means if we're looking at a child, let's say, who's like cutting class, to not see that as a lazy child, to see that as a child that is likely struggling with something, right? And so for the adult is understanding that all behavior is communication. Nothing, and the communication is something that they are struggling with emotionally or a skill that they are lacking and that allows them to be able to cope with what they're experiencing a lot of times. And that being a supportive, empathetic, understanding adult, and especially for this age group, being a listening ear oftentimes is more powerful than being a lecturer. Children at this age, they need to be heard. And as soon as you try to get into problem solving mode that you know all the answers, it's more challenging for them to be receptive to because even according to brain development, their peer group is more influential than adults
mm-hmm.
at this point, or more influential than the parent, like the people closest to them. So as a influential adult that is not the parent, I would say the most important thing you can do that will help a child is to hear them, to actually listen, not always trying to solve, but listen and validate their experience. Not always immediately like, oh, things are so hard at home. Oh, it can't be that bad. But look on the bright side. But at least you have this. Stop trying to like put blush on. Let them feel their feelings. And so that because part of a healing process and the ability to emotionally regulate is having validation that what you're feeling is real. And if people are always trying to tell you that what you're feeling is not real, or it could be worse if you were someone else, doesn't help a person understand that what they're feeling is real and therefore learn how to process what they're actually feeling. So that starts with just listening and not deflecting and trying to fix. Listen, validate.
Listen without judgment. I love it because
Yeah.
it's been something that was very when I would talk to people, whether it was a job interview or whatever, I would say, I don't know what I'm good at, but I know I'm good at validating a young person's feeling.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
I know I'm good at listening to them. And this
Yeah.
is not about me tooting my horn.
Yeah.
I'm saying
Yeah.
I've seen the value of it. I've
Yes.
watched that child become lighter over the course of a
Yes.
few conversations because all I did was say, man, that must be tough.
Yes.
Wow.
And I'm sorry that this also goes back to being an oppressed, marginalized group. It's something that is in common with all of those is that you'll hear these things is they're not believed.
Yes.
People do not believe their experiences and are trying to see the world through their own experience. And so this is again one of those things if you want to be anti-childish or like to say like an adultist mindset,
Yeah.
if you want to help with that work, then believing what young people say is a huge step toward that.
Thank you, Joy, so much. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this conversation.
Same thing.
I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and it was so enlightening. Thanks so much and have a great night.
Thank you, you too.
Again, a special thanks to my guest, Joy Marilie Jackson. You can find links to all of her socials in the show notes. Please don't forget to subscribe or rate the show or leave a comment or a review. Share with your friends. Anything that can get us to more ears would be greatly appreciated. Your 12-Year-Old Self is a Fairmount Media production, and it's hosted, written, and produced by me, Mike Nicholson. Questions, comments, guest suggestions can be emailed to your12yearoldself@gmail.com. That's your 12-year-old self with the number 12 at gmail.com. The theme song is Never a Worthless Moon by Yawns. Logo design by Rose Bear Arts. Digital marketing consulting by Krista Lemon. Social media consulting by Jessica Hawk. Special thanks to Ron Cornwall and Sarah Finney. And my profound gratitude goes out to my wife, Courtney.